Welcome back to Courtroom Conversations on the Classic Courtroom YouTube channel. I'm Dylan Brooks Hamilton, and today we're diving into a case that's got us all scratching our heads. Two death row inmates who are saying no thanks to President Biden's offer of clemency. If you enjoy unraveling legal mysteries like this one, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more intriguing deep dives.
Sounds fascinating.
To help us unpack this unusual situation, I'm joined by the insightful Susan Kelly Ashford.
Always happy to be here.
So let's set the scene. President Biden recently commuted 37 federal death sentences, a move largely seen as a step toward abolishing capital punishment at the federal level. You'd think everyone on death row would be celebrating, right?
You would think there would at least be a sense of relief.
Exactly. But two inmates, Shannon Agofsky and Len Davis, both at the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, have filed motions to block the commutation. They're arguing that accepting a life sentence without parole would actually hurt their chances of appealing their cases and potentially proving their innocence.
That's a very bold strategy. What's their reasoning?
Well, they seem to be banking on the concept of heightened scrutiny in death penalty cases.
I see.
Can you break that down for us? What does heightened scrutiny mean in this context?
Sure. So basically, because of the severity of a death penalty case, there's a higher burden of proof on the courts, more rigorous examination of evidence, a greater chance for appeals to be successful.
So they're essentially saying, look, we have a better chance of proving our innocence if we stay on death row.
It seems that way. Yeah, it's a high-stakes gamble.
For sure. And it gets even more complicated. There's a 1927 Supreme Court ruling, Biddle v. Purovich, that clearly states that a president's power to grant clemency is absolute. Doesn't require the convict's consent.
So legally speaking, the president can commute a sentence even if the inmate doesn't want it. This makes things much more difficult for Agofsky and Davis.
Absolutely. So let's delve a little deeper into their cases, starting with Shannon Agofsky. He was convicted in 1998 for the murder of a bank president in Oklahoma. But he was already serving a life sentence for that crime when he was convicted in 2001 for the stomping death of a fellow inmate in a Texas prison. That second murder landed him on death row.
That's a crucial detail about the life sentence for the first murder. It really feeds into their argument for heightened scrutiny.
So?
Well, they could argue that the circumstances of that second conviction, while already incarcerated, warrant an even more thorough review.
Like they're saying, hey, this didn't happen in the normal way. We need the highest level of scrutiny to ensure justice was served.
Exactly. They're using the complexities of their situation to their advantage.
It's a really unique legal strategy. But going up against a precedent that strongly favors presidential clemency.
It'll be interesting to see how the courts balance those competing interests. On the one hand, the president's authority. On the other hand, the principle of a fair trial and due process. Especially when you're talking about such serious consequences.
Right. And to add another layer, there's the personal element in Agofsky's case. He married a woman named Laura over the phone in 2019. And she firmly believes in his innocence.
Wow.
She's been very vocal in her support, even working with the German coalition to abolish the death penalty.
It really humanizes this whole legal battle. Reminds us that we're not just talking about abstract laws, but real people with families and loved ones.
Now let's turn our attention to Len Davis, the other inmate refusing the commutation. His story takes us back to a dark time for the New Orleans Police Department.
Oh, yes. This case is a powerful reminder of what can happen when there's abuse of power within law enforcement.
Davis, a former police officer, was convicted in 1994 for the murder of Kim Groves, a woman who had filed a police brutality complaint against him.
Oh, wow.
Prosecutors said that Davis hired a drug dealer to silence Groves, and he was charged with violating her civil rights.
And this was part of a much wider federal investigation into corruption within the New Orleans police force, right?
Exactly, a disturbing pattern of misconduct and brutality.
And Davis still claims he's innocent.
He does. He maintains that the federal court had no jurisdiction to try him for civil rights offenses.
So that could be another angle in their appeal. They might argue that the case should have been handled at the state level, potentially leading to a different sentence.
It's a multi-pronged approach for sure, casting doubt on every aspect of their cases. So it's not just about the clemency itself. They're also trying to revisit the very basis of their convictions.
Wow, this is getting really interesting.
Before we dive into the implications of their legal fight and the whole context of the death penalty in the U.S., let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue to unravel this case. We'll look at the reactions to Biden's commutations and what this case could mean for clemency in the future.
Can't wait. So where do we go from here? What are the potential implications of all this?
Well, if the courts side with Agofsky and Davis, it could set a pretty significant precedent. It could change the whole landscape of presidential clemency. Imagine a scenario where every inmate facing a commutation could challenge the decision.
It would create a logistical and legal nightmare. It would really undermine the purpose of clemency, wouldn't it?
Right, because clemency is about offering a less severe punishment when appropriate, regardless of what the inmate wants.
Exactly. It's a powerful tool for presidents. It allows them to show mercy, correct injustices, act in the nation's best interest. But if it's always tied up in legal battles, it loses its effectiveness.
So realistically, what are the chances that Agofsky and Davis will actually win this?
Honestly, it's a tough one. As we discussed, the Supreme Court has been very clear that the president's power to grant clemency is absolute, no consent needed.
Right.
But we also talked about the heightened scrutiny in death penalty cases and the importance of individualized sentencing.
So they're hoping that by really pushing those points, they can sway the courts. Do you think that'll work?
It's a long shot, I have to say. But you never know. The legal system is all about precedent, but it can change and adapt, too. These are unique circumstances. They could lead to a re-examination of how we think about clemency.
So this case could change things in a big way.
It really could. It's going to be fascinating to see what the courts decide. This could impact the balance of power between the president and the courts.
Let's zoom out for a second and talk about the death penalty in the U.S. Biden's commutations are just one part of this huge, ongoing debate. You mentioned he's personally opposed to the death penalty. So where do these commutations fit in with that?
It's interesting because they're a big step, but they don't completely abolish the death penalty at the federal level. It suggests his actions are more about pragmatism than idealism.
Right. It's not black and white.
Not at all. And the reactions to the commutations show that some people are praising Biden, others are condemning him.
It's definitely a divisive issue. Human rights groups are applauding it. They see it as a move towards a more humane justice system. But there are organizations like the Office of the Independent Police Monitor in New Orleans that are very critical, especially about Len Davis's case.
They feel like he was shown more mercy than his victim ever received.
Exactly. And it raises a tough question when we talk about clemency whose interests are most important.
It's a hard one. Is it justice for the victims and their families? Or is it about holding the perpetrator accountable? Or is it about mercy and the possibility of rehabilitation? Balancing all of that is what makes the clemency debate so challenging.
It's a really complex issue, and it's about so much more than just these two cases.
Absolutely. It touches on some fundamental principles about how our country is run and what justice really means.
The death penalty is a huge topic in the U.S. We're one of the few developed countries that still has it.
That's true. And these cases really highlight the ethical dilemmas and legal challenges that go along with it.
There's a growing movement to abolish the death penalty altogether. People are concerned about whether it's moral, whether mistakes are made, and the fact that minorities are disproportionately affected by it.
All valid concerns.
For sure. Support for the death penalty has been going down, but it's still a very divisive issue. And these cases force us to ask some really big questions.
Like whether the state has the right to take a life.
Exactly. Is the death penalty just? Or is it cruel and unusual punishment? These are tough questions, but they're important to discuss.
We need to have these conversations with nuance and empathy, be open to hearing different perspectives.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up, let's go back to something you said earlier about the human side of all this.
Yes. It's easy to get lost in the legal details, but we can't forget about the people involved.
These aren't just abstract cases. Shannon and Agofsky have a wife who believes he's innocent. Len Davis has a family and friends dealing with this. And of course, there's King Groves, the victim in Davis's case. Her loved ones are still looking for justice and healing.
It's important to remember that.
So as we come to the end of our deep dive, I'm curious to hear your final thoughts on these cases.
They really highlight the contradictions in our justice system. On the one hand, the president is trying to offer mercy. On the other hand, the inmates are choosing to fight for their right to appeal. It's a clash of principles that could change how we deal with clemency in the future, and it shows that we need to keep talking about the death penalty and reforming the justice system.
It's a reminder that things aren't always black and white.
Exactly.
And that there are human stories at the heart of every case. Now, before we go, I want to leave our listeners with a question to think about.
Okay.
If you were in Agofsky or Davis's position, knowing what they know, would you accept the commutation or would you fight for your chance to appeal? Even if it meant staying on death row, it's a tough decision, a moral and legal dilemma.
It really makes you think about what justice truly means.
It really does.
Yeah.
It's a question that makes you stop and think about the complexities of the law. You know, even with clear legal precedents, there's always room for different interpretations. Those gray areas always seem to pop up.
Absolutely. And that's what I find so intriguing about this whole case. It's not just about the specifics of the crimes or the appeals. It's about the bigger picture, the meaning of justice, mercy, the power of the president, all of that.
It's a case that really makes you think critically about how our system works and whether it's truly serving justice.
And it brings us back to the human element, the personal stories behind the legal battles.
Exactly. We can't forget about that. So as we wrap up this deep dive into this unusual and thought-provoking case, I want to encourage our viewers to keep the conversation going. Head over to the comments and tell us what you think. Would you accept clemency in their situation? What does justice look like here?
I'd love to hear everyone's perspectives.
And don't forget to join the conversation on our social media. We love hearing from our viewers.
Yeah.
And a huge thank you to Susan Kelly Ashford for sharing your expertise and insights on this complex case.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our viewers, thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the courtroom. Remember, the pursuit of justice never ends.